name is Kyla Williams Tate, and I am the host of the Digital Determinants Podcast. Welcome to episode 2. The Digital Determinants Podcast is where we delve into the complex systemic reasons behind the presence of digital inequity and the challenges surrounding digital adoption within those communities comprising the generations from the Great Migration. So that's a mouthful. And in plain language, we're basically trying to determine what was the impact of the Great Migration and all the things that happened to get people to those recipient cities and all of the experiences they dealt with and were challenged with or had success with, and how that has impacted generations to come, like myself. I am a descendant of the Great Migration. My grandmother came here. If you listen to episode 1, which we'll link at the end of this episode, my grandmother migrated here from Mississippi. So did my mother. She was around 4 at the time. So I wanted to examine that relationship and what happened on those journeys and what led to folks coming to the North in the first place, and what did they see when they got here, and how that has impacted our ability to adopt digital technologies. And if there is a relationship, can that help us to understand and make recommendations of how we get more folks to adopt the internet and fully participate in digital society. So that is basically the crux of this podcast. So if you tuned in to episode 1, I shared that between 1916 and 1970, Chicago attracted more than 500,000 of the approximately 7 million African Americans who left the South. 500,000 new people, new bodies, children, babies, adults, seniors, all coming into an area that was not necessarily prepared for their arrival. Before the migration, African Americans constituted only 2% of Chicago's population, but by 1970, they were 33%. That is a great population growth in a short period of time. Before widespread automobile ownership, because everybody didn't have a vehicle, believe it or not, and everyone wasn't allowed to purchase a vehicle or own a vehicle. So before that moment happened historically, migration from the South generally followed along water and railroad routes. Chicago's popularity as a destination rested in part because the Illinois Railroad Central Network, or the Illinois Central Railroad Network, ran its line and its feeder lines into those southern states and in those places and pockets where Black Southerners were seeking refuge to the northern states. So those railroad routes were incredibly important as the network built down into those plantation regions, and then Black people were able to not only ride the trains in segregated cars, but there were also Pullmans and railroad attendants that were Black that were allowed to be employed, and those were good jobs. And we'll talk a little bit about the Pullman area and its historical meanings to this storyline that I'm sharing here. Beginning in 1916, so Chicago drew most of its population from the Deep South. So that's Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Western Georgia. And this is important, and I made a note about this in the last episode, that if you look at the migration map, where you landed was, I would say, certainly inspired by the railroad lines, but there was other determinant factors that led to why people ended up in the places that they ended up in. And so for Chicago, we got a lot of the western portions of Georgia versus like the eastern portions of Georgia. And we'll talk about that also in a future episode. I know y'all probably sick of me saying in a future episode, but there's just so much to unpack here in this storyline. I am taking my time with telling these stories so that, one, I could try to get as many facts right and lean into the research arm of this. But it's important that we take the time and we share the stories, because there's a big movement to retell these stories and erase a lot of this history. So I am trying to do my best to capture the stories and document these moments for others to learn and share, so that we all have more knowledge about what was happening during those times and what is happening during these times. And sadly, some of that is still the same. So although the migration from the South contributed to Chicago's Black community since the 1840s, so there were folks who were traveling from the South who were coming up to Chicago for a variety of reasons. Maybe there was family that was already here. Maybe there was people who worked on the railroad lines who said, when we stop in Chicago, it seems like it's a nice place. There could be a variety of reasons of why there was the trickling of folks before the Great Migration period that came to Chicago. So in Chicago in the 1840s, there were folks here already. And we already know the story that there was folks here before us folks, right? Hence all of our Native American names, and hence all of the new proclamations when you're standing on the sacred lands for the Native American people who were here and populated this area. Chicago offered very few opportunities to Black Southerners until World War I. Chicago, like the rest of the North, offered freedom from legally sanctioned racial discrimination, in theory. Let's put an asterisk on that. But industrial employers turned away African Americans who approached the factory gates. So folks, how they got jobs is they kind of would just show up at your place of employment and ask if you had work that was available, and would offer themselves as folks willing to, take jobs or take up work. But they used to be turned away because, again, there's just a deep history of discriminatory practices against Black people, especially as it pertains to employment. And so this is no surprise to me and shouldn't be any surprise to you. So there was widespread beliefs about the aptitude. Now let me say this again. There was widespread belief around the aptitude of racial and ethnic groups on the part of the employers relegated to East and South European immigrants to the least skilled jobs in the industry. And African Americans had even fewer opportunities. So there was already some discriminatory practices in place for Eastern and South European immigrants. And then even less than that towards Black people from the South. So let's just talk about that from like a prioritization of racial discrimination. There were people who had jobs. People who had jobs that were willing to pay people to work the jobs. So when the other immigrants arrived at the gates at the factories and it was like, hey, we would like to work. We want to be able to take care of our families. There was some discrimination, but they would let them come in and work, but they would get the least skilled jobs because folks just didn't believe that they were smart enough to be able to do any of the other work. So then when the Black people came and was like, hey, we would like to work, we want to take care of our families too, they were further discriminated against and said, you can't even occupy the least of the skills of those kind of jobs. And that's just horrible. I just can't even imagine me as a Black woman with my big old brain and curiosity, energy, to be told that I didn't have the aptitude to do the least skilled jobs. It's upsetting on so many levels. So I'm trying not to get emotional in this episode because there's just so much to say. So Black people who were allegedly incapable of regular discipline work, they were virtually excluded except as temporary strike breakers. So let me break this down. So in the factories, let's say there was something happening that employees were not happy about. So the employees, presumably white and presumably male, would then go on strike to teach the employers a lesson. You can't conduct your business without us employees, and you need to ensure that us employees are being treated fairly and compensated fairly and all the things that consist of employees' rights. So those white male employees would then get with those East and South European immigrants, and they would go on strike to show the employers that they had power. Then, and only then, were Black people allowed to work in those factories because, the almighty dollar takes precedence over many things. And we can see some of that today for sure. So Black people were allowed to work into those factories as temporary strike breakers. And notably in Chicago, in the meatpacking district and industry in 1904. So that's where you saw Black people starting to show up in those factory jobs. Now, when World War I halted immigration from Europe, and we, of course, had all of these orders for manufactured goods coming out of the Chicagoland area, employers needed a new source of labor for jobs that were assumed to be men's work, men's work jobs, factory jobs, jobs that required physical labor. So they needed a new labor source. Then factories opened the doors to Black workers, providing opportunities to Black Southerners eager to stake their claim for full citizenship through their role in the industrial economy. Black people, unlike any kind of stigma that is associated with us as a people around being lazy and not wanting to work, was willing to work, has always been willing to work, but has not been afforded the opportunities. One can say that still exists today. Black men were allowed to go and work into the factories doing men's work. Black women, those doors were closed. You couldn't go work into a factory. You only were allowed to do women's work, which was more like domestic work, being a maid, being a cook, being a caregiver of folks' children. So there were already gender discriminatory practices happening, certainly, even in white society. But even further down in Black society, where at least the Black men were allowed to go work in the factories, but the Black women were allowed to work into the factories. And even though those wages were slightly higher in the factory, but still lower than what the white people were making and what the European immigrants were making, they were still decent enough jobs so people could take care of their families, take care of their children, buy a home or rent an apartment or whatever they needed to do at this time, even send money back to the South as they were planning to bring even more and more of the family members up. So these jobs were super important. And for those who were lucky enough to get one and they were able to start making money, certainly sharing that news back home, saying, hey, I work in this factory and I'm earning a decent wage. You should come up here and I'll try to get you a job at the factory too. So that game of telephone around opportunity, I'm sure also played a big role in folks wanting to come to Chicago. So this information certainly spread quickly in the South. And there was a catalyst to ensure that everybody knew about this information. And that catalyst was the Chicago Defender newspaper. So the Chicago Defender newspaper, as I mentioned in episode 1, has played a significant portion, a significant role, an essential role in the Great Migration. It was the city's leading Black newspaper, and one may even say the nation's leading Black newspaper in many ways. Starting in 1916, the paper published stories about Southerners who had made it in the big city of Chicago. So they would advertise help with travel and housing and jobs, and would list churches and other organizations that the potential migrants could write to and figure out how they could connect and arrange for their travel up to Chicago. So again, my grandmother came to Chicago from Mississippi. Did she write to someone? Who did she write to? Or was there someone already here? Maybe one of her brothers or maybe one of her uncles were working on the train route. How did she not only make the decision to come, but who did she see when she got here? I've not figured that out yet, but I'm working on it. So for those who are already in Chicago, the Defender would also routinely print these rules of conduct to help new arrivals adjust and avoid conflict. Because again, 500,000 people over a period of time is a lot of people to come into a area. And I'm sure folks just wasn't prepared for the people, generally speaking, but certainly people that look like me. So the Chicago Defender newspaper would publish these tips such as, don't allow yourself to be drawn into street brawls, and don't use liberty to do what you please. Now that's code for don't y'all come up here and be acting a fool out here in these places and spaces that y'all are new to. These people are already agitated that y'all are here. So don't be coming up here and making no unnecessary noise and doing things that are not going to be helpful to the rest of the folks who are also trying to come up here. So these messages were intended to bridge the Black community's increasing range of social behavior, because certainly in the Jim Crow South, where any wrong move or any rumor or any lie told on you could have you hanging from a tree in front of your own house. So there was certainly not that type of activity per se happening in the Chicagoland area, not like in the South. Now, I'm not saying that the people who arrived here didn't experience racism when they were here. I think that the influx of how many people were descending upon Chicago, that the folks that were already here had not organized yet. So they were already feeling and exhibiting racist practices in employment and housing and other places. But they needed some time to organize so that they could figure out systemically how they were going to keep Black people from thriving and surviving in some cases in the North. So it had to be an experience getting here. And the Defender having the knowledge and the wherewithal to help Black people stay safe while they were migrating to Chicago and in other places was just not only necessary, but almost genius. It was like this newspaper was the roadmap of how to help Black people achieve economic freedom. And I'm really excited to be able to bring you that interview with the folks at the Chicago Defender newspaper. So stay tuned for that. So the newspaper was a 64 gallery size page thing. And I read some research that said that military intelligence, and I'm not sure exactly what military intelligence means. It didn't say specifically what branch, but military intelligence in strict confidence from the Defender's distributor during the post-World War federal investigations of radicals said that the Defender's circulation of approximately 50,000 issues, 50,000 newspapers in 1916 was an important factor in the Great Migration of Black Southerners to modern cities. A Tennessee Railroad worker in 1970 was quoted as saying, "I bought a Chicago Defender newspaper, and after reading it and seeing the golden opportunity I have, decided to leave this place at once." So there was such hope and such inspiration built into these newspapers that people were immediately planning on leaving the South and heading north. So by 1919, the Defender's advocacy of migration had won new subscribers, especially in the South, and that contributed to 3/4 of its approximately 130,000 circulation that year. So it was a subscription service. And there were so many new subscribers from the South that it contributed 3/4 of its approximately 130,000 circulations that year in 1919. Incredible, just incredible how that newspaper was able to organize itself and implement a strategy to help to inspire a nation of movement, of the largest people movement in North America. That's a big deal. Now, as I was thinking back about all of this, because this is a lot, I'm sitting here, I am sitting with this information, I'm learning so much. And it's interesting how you can draw reference to things that are happening today. So thinking about the newspaper publishing those tips for people to stay safe and, instilling trust and giving permission for people to make the moves, get the courage to make the moves to move from the South to the North. And it reminded me of an IG post that I recently saw. So this IG post was advertising tourism to Leland, Michigan, which is in the lower peninsula of the state. And apparently Leland, Michigan is a fishing town. And this video, it shows such beautiful rolling water and these charming little houses along the waterline. And it really captured my attention. I have decided and shared with my husband that I wanted to do more like road trips. We've done a lot of airplane trips in our time together, but I want to do some new road trips, go to some new places, some interesting places, discover those things that we can drive to, a few hours from our home. And was thinking, oh, this looks like a good place to go. And the entity that posted the video, Detroit Got Talent, invited visitors to escape to the enchanting shores of Leland, Michigan. And I was enchanted, child. I was like, yes, I am going. But before I even made the decision to share it with my husband, my next immediate thought about Leland, Michigan was, is it safe for Black people to be there? If me, my husband, and my son, me, my husband, and my goddaughter, me, my husband, and our other family members go to Leland, Michigan for a vacation, what will be there waiting for us? Will we be safe? Will our kids be safe? Will we be able to fully participate in all of the places and spaces that our money has paid for. I thought that. And the first comment under that invitation was from a poster, Black Garden Girl 75, who asked, can Black people come out there? And then in parentheses, she said, and yes, this is a serious question. And that was my question too. No, I don't know Black Garden Girl 75, but she sounds like somebody I should get to know, because as y'all see my plants behind me, sis loves to garden, sis loves some plants, okay? But there was some immediate trust in her asking this question. Can we trust you, Detroit Got Talent, that if we bring our Black people to this area, that we are going to be safe? We are going to be able to do and enjoy and participate in all that Leland, Michigan has to offer. And the Chicago Defender newspaper was just that. They played such an important role in establishing trust. These migration trails and these kind of sneak peeks, like they were running peeks of folks from the South to come to the North so that they could really see what was happening in the area before they made the decision to fully move. Just the newspaper played an important role in establishing trust. So I'm pretty confident that it had to be one of the reasons why my grandmother made the decision to leave her 4 children in Mississippi and be courageous to come to Chicago. It had to be. The Defender had to play a role in her doing that. For some Black Southerners, where they landed initially when they traveled to Chicago was the Wabash Avenue YMCA on the South Side. The Wabash Avenue YMCA is a Chicago landmark. It's located within the Black metropolis, Bronzeville Historic District, and the Douglas community area of Chicago. The Y served as an important social center and housing center within the Black metropolis area in Chicago. It also provided job training for African Americans who were migrating to Chicago in the early 20th century. So the Wabash Avenue Y opened in 1914. This is about to be good, y'all. Talk about Chicago history. And it was supported by Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the president of the Sears, Roebuck and Company. Rosenwald had a philanthropic interest in Black-oriented causes. The YMCA that he helped to support provided job training such as auto repair and other kinds of manufacturing training so that Black people could get jobs and be trained to do those jobs. So in 1915, so the Y opened in 1914, but in 1915, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History was founded by the great historian Carter G. Woodson, right at the Wabash Avenue Y. He founded it using that center as a meeting place for all of the other leaders that wanted to establish and preserve Black history. They called Carter G. Woodson the father of African American history. So he, along with William B. Hartgrove, George Cleveland Hall, Alexander L. Jackson, and James E. Stamps, was one of the first groups specializing in African American studies that was founded during a meeting at the Wabash Y. And the Wabash Y is also credited as being the birthplace of Black History Month.
We begin our celebration of Black History Month at its birthplace in Bronzeville. Nearly a century ago, the origins of Black History Month began at the Wabash Avenue YMCA, led by the famed Carter G. Woodson. CBS 2's Ryan Baker takes us on a tour of this living landmark.
Kathy, they call this place the living landmark.
Yes, they do, the living landmark.
So much history here on the south side.
A lot of history. It's incredible.
If these walls could talk, huh?
Oh my goodness.
The historic Wabash Y would certainly have a whole lot to say.
This is the birthplace of African History Month. It was actually started in the hallway right across from here.
The Renaissance Collaborative, which currently owns and operates the over century-old building, is committed to keeping the legacy of this true landmark alive in the Bronzeville community.
I think the churches really wanted to save the landmark for the future generations. And yet, most of the future generations have no idea that this building exists.
Once slated for demolition, this Southside treasure on 37th and Wabash was restored and reopened in 2001. Back in the 1920s, during the Great Migration, this YMCA was one of the few places where black men coming north could stay.
Up until the point of this building being developed, there was no place for people of color to live. If you didn't have relatives here, there was no space for you.
And find refuge from racism.
The Negro stockyard workers, when they didn't receive their wages, they all piled up in here.
The Y was also a hub of culture and creativity, cultivating the arts and athleticism.
We had Harlem Globetrotters here.
And a community resource for healthcare and education, a mission that the Renaissance Collaborative continues today.
Job training, job readiness. We do a lot of prep work on interviews, customer service skills, just to get people back into the workplace.
It's still a resource for the community.
Absolutely.
In Bronzeville, right?
Yep. Everything that we offer is free.
We're always looking for innovative ways of putting people to work. So even though we serve the homeless, we also serve the broader community as well.
To keep it thriving and growing.
Mm-hmm.
The Renaissance Collaborative is conducting tours of the historic Wabash YMCA every Saturday during Black History Month. Future renovations are in the works, but because of the Y's landmark status, construction is limited in order to preserve the building's architectural integrity.
So, let's turn our attention to the Wabash Y today. It's located at 3763 South Wabash Avenue in Chicago. If we look on the University of Chicago's Data Science Institute Internet Equity Initiative map, shout out to Dr. Alexis Shruby. She and her team have provided an internet connectivity map to show gaps and disparities and where there is adequate internet coverage. So if we look at that map, you'll see that I was able to drill down into the place that houses the Wabash Avenue YMCA. This says the former Wabash Avenue YMCA, but the current Wabash YMCA is still located in that area, and there's just a larger building that encompasses it. But if you look at the broadband access in that area, it shows that there's about 70% of folks that have access to a broadband subscription. If you talk about computers in the household, now we're talking about 80% of the folks have computers in the household. We don't know what type of computers, but there's something in the household. The percentage of college grads are between 0 and 25%, it looks like. If you look at the percentage of Black people that live in that area, about 89% of that area is Black folks. There's a small percentage of Hispanic people that live there. And when we're talking about the median household income, they're certainly on the lower side of the scale versus across the city of Chicago. But if you go back to the broadband access, again, between 70 and 80%, around 66.7% is what it says here, but based on the colors, it seems like about 70% have access. But that if you pan out, there are areas that are next to this area, above this area, that have greater broadband access. And if broadband access is supposed to be something that everyone has, it's a right. It's a right as a person that everyone in this century should have access to the internet, then why doesn't this area have 100%? So if you scroll just north of this community, we noticed that on the campus of Illinois Institute of Technology that they have 100% broadband access. So we know that institutions play a role in how the neighborhood accesses the internet. So let's put a pin in that for a future discussion. So when I look at the maps and I'm, scrolling in and out, I'm trying to figure out what is in those areas, such as like the central railroad yard, that helps to create these webs of connectivity. There has to be some institution or some organization or some corporation that's helping to contribute to the connectivity of the area. But when you scroll all the way out, you can see that there's a high concentration of disconnectivity or large connectivity gaps in the South, in the West, and now I'm going further into Cook County, suburban Cook County. And as you can see, to the south and to the west, there's a lot of red, indicating that the percentage of households with broadband subscriptions are low in those areas. So in October of 2023, Cook County created its digital equity map. I went to the digital equity map, the Cook County digital equity map, and entered in the address for the Wabash Avenue Y. And as you can see here, on our map, we captured a little bit of different information than the Internet Equity Initiative's map. The Wabash Avenue Y, its address has a digital equity score of 42 out of 100 points. So when we're looking at broadband access, certainly that 69.8% is still present. When you look at how people access the internet, because that's important. The percentage of households with broadband, cable, fiber optic, or DSL subscription, if you look at that, it's between 0 and, in this map, 69.8% for the folks that live in that particular geographic region. But when you look at how they access the internet, exclusively through cellular plans, it's about 12%. 12% of the folks are accessing the internet through a cellular data plan only. So that means no broadband access at home. If you look at folks that have computers in the household, so that could be a smartphone, a tablet, and other devices, certainly there's a large amount, 76.91%. We are believing that a significant amount of those devices are either cell phones or tablets that were given to children from schools. When you look at people who only have a smartphone in the house, that's about 10% of the folks in that area only have a smartphone in the house. And then there's a 10% of folks that have a disability, which means they need some special support and assistance as they're accessing the internet. And then we have only 41% of the folks that have a bachelor's degree. Again, this is a large percentage of the population is Black. There's a goodly amount of folks in that area that have children in the household under the age of 18. There's about 12.78% of the folks in that area that are 65 and older. And we know that there's some support that's needed for them to digitally adopt and get digital aptitude. This is a great statistic. it's a horrible statistic, but it's a great thing to track in digital equity, and that's around housing cost burden, because affordability is something that we talk a lot about in accessing the internet, and 33.8% of the folks in this area experience housing cost burden, and that may be a reason why there is no internet in the home outside of what's available in a phone, because folks just simply can't afford to have the high-speed connection. We have about 85% of English proficiency in this area, which means that there's about 15% that we need to account for with language access. So going back to this digital equity score of 42 for this particular area, it signifies, at least using this map, that there's a lot of opportunity that we can build upon here to ensure that this area has a higher digital equity score and that we get them closer to 100. We are starting to see some patterns of correlation between where African Americans landed in Chicago to accessibility and connectivity rates. But what about the other recipient cities, like Detroit and Los Angeles and Philadelphia? What role did the Chicago Defender newspaper play in where folks migrated to those places, and what are those connectivity rates? There are so many more stories to tell, and I am going to do my level best to tell them well. My name is Kyla Williams Tate. I am the host of the Digital Determinants Podcast. A new episode of this podcast is released typically on the 1st and the 15th of every month. We're releasing this one specifically on Juneteenth to honor all of our folks who are still in the fight for the pursuit of freedom. You can see this podcast on my YouTube channel or listen to it on Spotify. You can find the links on your own at digitaldeterminants.com. I will be building out this website in the coming weeks to make it a bit more interactive. We have a lot planned for this podcast and we're just getting started. So bear with me as I pull it all together. And we're going to be adding a subscription option so that we can send you some information if you're interested in this information, and can follow me on my research journey. Thanks for listening or watching episode 2. Please share this podcast among your networks, and as always, stay connected.